narcissistic, dependent people who basically used their daughter as almost a psychotherapist to comfort them and took advantage of her, emotionally exploited her, and that continued all through her life, okay? And she complied with them and gave them everything that they wanted, pretty much, except for the anorexia. Now, she had had a couple of hospitalizations as a teenager. She always went back to it and back to it. She was maybe 5'6", 5'7", very attractive young woman, extremely thin when she went into the therapy. Maybe 80 pounds, 85 pounds, okay? And the therapist, my colleague, who was consulting with me about the treatment, she and I talked once a week just about this one case for 3 years. And she tried to work really... Oh, by the way, a lot of times with bad, dangerous anorexics who might die, the recommendation is you have to put them in the hospital. You've got to force feed them if they won't do it any other way, or give them behavior modification so they'll start eating or something like that. But real bad anorexics won't let you do that to them. And this woman had made it clear that if her therapist tried to hospitalize her, she would kill herself immediately. And she meant business. There was no question about it. Anything about force feeding or behavior modification, forget it. And there are cases in the literature, plenty of them, where people have responded to such forceful treatment with attempts or successful attempts at suicide even. I won't say that happened every time. It doesn't, but it can happen. Because that's why it's so important. It's like stripping off the clothes of the person. What you need to do is get with what this is about, why it's there, what happened in this life, that this is the only way she can assert her will. If we can understand that and make her feel that she is understood in the struggle, maybe she can find other ways of establishing herself as a person. So I can't do justice to the whole thing, but here's my memory in outline of what happened. The therapist I was helping was a very sensitive, brilliant, empathic, just excellent person, extremely devoted, saw the patient 2 or 3 times a week, and talked to her in enormous depth about her life history, about her exploitation by her depressed, narcissistic parents, talked to her about her compliance or surrender to them, about the importance of her establishing herself as an independent person existing in her own right, having a life, having ambitions, having values and goals that would belong just to her, not her parents. And they could talk about this not just as an abstract kind of set of considerations, but actually in ways that this woman began to feel understood by more and more deeply as they went along, and began to get in touch with being angry at the parents for having used her so much. It's a huge breakthrough for an anorexic patient to achieve anger at the mistreatment or deprivation or hyper-control of the parents. It means that she's entitled to be treated differently. Something is coming into being. It was like that. But here was the problem. What I saw happening is that, and as their relationship solidified, the analyst and the patient was living separately from the parents, she began to eat a little bit more and her weight began to go up. So it wasn't 80, it was 90, 95 pounds. Oh my God, you could survive at 95, even if you're 5'6" or 5'7". But the problem was this. The parents were still alive. And what they would do, they lived in a distant city, but they loved being with their daughter. And they would just come in, often unannounced, and just move into her house and put all kinds of demands on her. And she wasn't able to resist them. She couldn't say, "Get out!" She wasn't to a point where she could say that. It would be, you need to be able to say, "Get out" to your parents. An anorexic can't possibly say that. And so what would happen is they would be there, they'd move in, they'd be there for 2 full weeks, eating her food, letting her cook for them and all this, and she would then react to their visit by another bout of self-starvation. Really bad. I mean, her weight would plummet. The therapist would be calling her all the time, imploring her, begging her to please eat, get a milkshake, go to the Dairy Queen, do anything. But she wouldn't do it and wouldn't do it. And then hopefully, after a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks of starving, she would begin to come back around. And so this was happening back and forth as these parents came there. I wanted to take out a lawsuit or take out a court order against the parents. They can't go there, but you can't get a court order for that. Well, you've got to let me visit my daughter. But you might kill your daughter if you keep visiting like this. They don't understand anything like that. So anyway, then I remember at the end of the 3rd year of therapy, and this was happening on and off with the visits of the parents and the bouts of self-starvation that were so dangerous to this patient. The patient wrote a letter. I wish I had this letter to read to you. I should ask for a copy of it. It is gorgeous. The letter was from the patient to the therapist. I'll paraphrase what it said, and I just want you to imagine a beautifully written, eloquent, articulate statement of gratitude. That's what it was. It said, "Dear Shelley," that was the name of the therapist, "I want to tell you how profoundly grateful I am for you having saved my life and helped me discover my own soul." That's what it said. And it went on and on and on about the journey of the therapy had opened up a whole world to her of coming to know her own identity, discovering her own feelings, finding goals for herself that became more and more meaningful. And so it was like a wonderful testimonial. You love to get this from your patients. You want to make a difference to their lives. You want to be part of something that's going to help launch them on a career that's other than the self-destructive course of events that might have existed before. So I remember, Shelley called me up and read me the letter, and I said, "That is fantastic. We are on the right track with this patient. What else is going on?" She said, "Well, the parents have just come back to town." I said, "Oh, shit. Oh, no." They were there another week or so. Sure enough, even though the patient was doing so much better and was able to say so and express the gratitude and was making genuine progress, it was unsteady and unstable and vulnerable. And so they left. Here she goes again. She starves herself for about 10 days. Her weight went back down to 80 or something. And she wasn't intending to kill herself, but she ended up babysitting for a friend for some animals or something. The friend was on a vacation, so she was alone in a big house by herself. And she developed a case of the flu. And the symptoms of the flu that she developed included a whole bunch of throwing up and diarrhea, and her body got dehydrated. You know what happens when you're at 80 pounds and you get dehydrated? Your heart stops. She just died right there. My friend who was her therapist was just devastated. I was devastated too, because I was very plugged into this therapy. I never met the patient physically, but I was very emotionally involved in supporting her. This is the kind of thing that can happen. It is not a suicide. It is a set of actions she freely undertook in reaction to the captivity that she was experiencing with her parents. It killed her, but it wasn't at all the purpose. The purpose of the anorexic project is to reassert agency. It does so in a self-destructive and negative sort of way, often ends in death in the extreme cases. It doesn't have to, but it's always a battle. It's always difficult. Nobody has a simple answer to how to just treat these patients and make sure that they live. Usually, if you have somebody who understands their situation and hangs in there, it works out much better than this one did. But this is the kind of thing that can happen, okay? So that's why I don't like that sort of a deal at all. Let me tell you one more, okay? So I've given you 3 now. Hit me, multiple sets of clothing, starving yourself to death. Why would people do these crazy things? Well, because it has a meaning in the context of the struggle of their life history if we can enter their worlds. That's what I'm trying to give you instances of. Example 3 goes like this. This one's kind of amazing and somewhat goofy, but interesting. I hope you'll be able to follow it. It is written up, by the way, in chapter 6 of Abyss of Madness. So you'll find a little section in Abyss of Madness called The Mothers of the Disappeared that covers this, relates to the example I'm going to give you. What is the example? Again, it's a pattern, but I have a case study to illustrate what I'm talking about. It's a pattern of behavior that looks really crazy. Why would a person do this? Self-cutting is the pattern. Okay? One of the so-called symptoms that we see often enough in severe psychological disturbances is the pattern of self-cutting. And this would not be cuts intended to kill, cuts that are deep enough to bleed to death, although sometimes you can have a well-developed self-cutting pattern, the person makes a mistake and cuts too deep, it's an artery, and they do bleed to death. But it's a well-known phenomenon that some people engage in, that they respond to the crises and stresses of their lives, and the way they deal with them is by cutting, and usually up and down one arm, but in extreme cases, the cuts can appear anywhere on the person's body. And there are some cases where a person's body becomes covered completely from head to toe with cuts. They're like a person with tattoos all over their body, but the tattoos are not tattoos. They are the scars from the cuts that have been inflicted. Okay? Why would people do that? It's delicate cutting. Why do they do that? Here's what they often say. I have to. It's the only way I can get relief. Relief from what? This horrible feeling of tension and pressure that builds up inside. They feel like they're a balloon that's going to burst with some kind of weird, incomprehensible pressure. And the only way they can get a sense of release or calm is to cut and cut and cut and cut. And something that looks almost like an addiction to cutting begins to occur. Or if they deal with stress by cutting. They get stressed, they cut. They get stressed, they cut. They cut, they cut, they cut. Why? They can't really explain it to you. It doesn't really make any sense. It's crazy. Or is it so crazy? How can we understand a thing like this? I have a theory on cutting that doesn't apply to every single case, but applies to a lot of them, I think. And it came to me in the context of a consultation I did with a psychoanalytic psychiatrist in the Midwest who had a patient who was one of the extreme cutters of all time in a psychiatric hospital, okay? The story goes like this. By the way, I think that the psychiatrist I'm going to describe was more disturbed than the patient she was treating. You'll see why as we go. But she didn't know that that was the case. The patient was 35 years old or so, covered with cuts from head to toe. Both legs, her feet, the bottoms of her feet, both arms, her breasts, her sides, everything, inside of her thighs, the whole deal. Cuts everywhere. She'd been doing it for 15 or 16, 18 years, ever since she was a young teenager. Her only explanation why she did it, I have to. Too much pressure, I can't stand it, I can't release the pressure any other way. So I asked the therapist what her understanding of this patient was. I'll just tell you some of the things she said. Well, I regard her as a severely regressed borderline with features of wanting to go back into the womb as the goal of her journey. I didn't like that. And I'm not going to worry too much about the term borderline. It's a diagnostic term I despise. If she was using it, I just let that go. I said, well, tell me more. What do you think is really going on? She said, well, in our work, what we've discovered is this, George Atwood, that beneath the layers of her defense mechanisms, which are more and more being penetrated, there's a deep underlying desire to retreat from all her conflicts with her own aggression and her sexuality, and go back into the peaceful environment of the womb where she can just passively be in a bliss state. That's what these cuts are all about. I said, why in the world would you think the cuts were about that? And how would they help, from her point of view, how would they help to get back into the womb if you were going to be cutting yourself like this? She said, well, the cuts themselves symbolize it. This is a kind of cockamamie psychoanalytic thing she was doing here. I said, tell me what you mean. She said, well, what she wants is the opening to her mother's body so she can climb in. But you can't really have that when you're a grown-up person. It ain't going to happen, is it? So in a sense, she becomes that opening that she longs for. Each cut is a little symbolic vagina carved in her flesh. It's a little symbolic image of the entrance to the mama's womb, okay? She wants to go in there, and that's why she does it. She becomes, there's something to that. There's like the idea that when you want someone you can't have, sometimes one of the ways we deal with that is we identify with that person and become that person. You know, the mechanism of identification. She was saying some kind of variation on that was working here. This made no sense to me. How in the world could you say that? She said, well, something just happened that proves it without a doubt, Atwood. I said, what's that? She said she just cut herself worse than ever before. And I said, what was that cut? The woman had carved the letters C-U-N-T deeper than ever before into her neck. The word cunt right across her neck in giant letters. Biggest, deepest cuts ever. Dangerous. She could have bled to death from this. 50, 60 stitches, here we go again. I said, how does that prove anything? She said, this proves it because she's using the cuts to write the word which the cuts symbolize. The only thing would be better if it would say W-O-M-B or V-A-G-I-N-A would have been fine too. I just thought, this is crazy. What in the world is she talking about? The patient was getting worse, not better, cutting more, not less, and she wasn't really working with her well at all. But I couldn't get through to the psychiatrist, so I asked to look at the patient's history and chart. And here's what I found out. The patient's 35 years old, but when she was 6, here's what had happened. She had basically been subjected to a month or two of horrific, appalling sexual attacks and sexual abuse by an older male relative in her family who had almost kidnapped her and raped her orally, anally, vaginally, and tortured her with ropes and did terrible, terrible things to a little 6-year-old, if you can imagine. And then what he did also was he would get up close to her as he was raping her. This is going to upset you. But you can't be in this field if you can't handle the upset of what it is. He would scream a word in her ear as he was raping her. What was that word? Cunt is what it is. You cunt, you cunt, you cunt. And then just raping and raping and raping her and hurting her and hurting her and hurting her. And so I had the brilliant idea, not too brilliant, is it? There might be a connection between him having used that word on her and the cut in her throat, on her neck that she had there. Because the use of that word is a kind of emotional rape all by itself. Shouting a horrible, devaluing, disparaging, disgusting term like that into a child's ear and into her mind rapes her mind and fills it with this trauma that is so bad, backed up by the physical trauma that's going on. And so it occurred to me, well, the reason she's writing it there is because it's what was done to her. It's a kind of protest against the injury that had been inflicted. So I read more deeply in the chart, historical chart. I wanted to know what was really done for this child after the abuse had taken place. The mother had found out about the abuse and put a stop to it. And now I isolated the girl from the cousin or uncle or whoever it was doing it. That person was not brought to justice. He got away scot-free, but he wasn't allowed to have access to the girl anymore. And what the family did was something like this. They said, that was a bad thing that happened. We're moving on now. You're safe. Let's not look back at that. It's over. Forget about it, okay? This family was like that. It was a kind of family that would turn away from really upsetting, terrible things and kind of cover it with a wall of denial and positive thinking. And let's look forward, not backward. That's what we all need to do. And so the massive injury that this patient had sustained in being sexually attacked as a child had more or less been denied out of existence by the family's pattern of looking away from it and focusing on the good and not the bad, the positive, not the negative. And so then it occurred to me, well then maybe that's why she has to put the cut there, because this is a reality that has been denied. And the further thought occurred to me involving a metaphor, that there's an analogy between what happened to her and what she was doing with her cuts. And this is also a general theory of the cutting. It's not just about her alone. And what happened in Argentina in the early 1970s, you guys may or may not know about that, but Argentina was taken over by these horrible military dictators. And what they would do to their political opponents, often young men, is capture them and take them on helicopters and dump them into the sea 50 miles out. And they would disappear. They were called the disappeared. They were made to disappear by the Argentinian government, who then would act as if they never existed. But what happened is the mothers of all these young people who were being killed by the military dictatorship would march back and forth before the presidential palace with giant placards and huge posters with photos of their children on them. And they were called the mothers of the disappeared. They wouldn't let the government forget that it had murdered their sons and daughters. You understand? They wouldn't just lie down and say, it's over, it's past, it's gone, let's move on, let's not look back, let's look forward. They're saying, no, the crimes of murder have occurred over and over and over again. So I suggested to the therapist, this is maybe what this woman is doing. She's cutting herself so much because these are injuries to her heart, injuries to her soul, rapes of her mind and heart and soul that have never been taken care of, that nobody really acknowledged fully, that everybody wanted to move away from rather than go into and help her really deal with them. And she's producing records, indelible records of these in her flesh. Why don't you talk to her about that? The therapist said she wasn't able to do that, did not agree with that theory. She thought the patient was making progress and was going to be able to break through to how she wanted to go inside the womb. This thing was just as crazy as could be. I could believe the patient wanted to have peace and quiet and bliss because her life had been hell of abandonment, exploitation, drug addiction, all kind of things. But I felt the patient's struggle was with deep traumas that had been inflicted on her, that had been denied by the positive thinking of her family. So the theory of cutting involved here is that the cut is like the mothers of the disappeared. The cut is a concrete proof of something that has happened that otherwise is obliterated. If I'm hurt and I'm asked to just go on from being hurt and think positively and not negatively, and nobody ever takes care of me in that hurt, they're kind of erasing a part of my being. They're erasing a part of the reality of who George even is, okay? This is a protest against such erasure. That's my theory. That would be one way of understanding something of the background phenomenology of the patterns of cutting I'm talking about. The patients don't themselves know this is what it is. They are so invalidated, so taken over by the family denial system, all they know is they feel this pressure, I gotta cut, I gotta cut, I gotta cut. But if they have a chance to really process their original injuries, there's a chance at least that the pattern of cutting could be given up. 15 years after my consultation, I found out this patient had continued the cutting for 15 more years and was still at it, and had not improved at all. The therapist had long since given up, and I'm not surprised because the therapy was no good. Anyway, go away. I've got to stop there. Sorry, guys.